My name is Margaret Chen. I am 64 years old. I live alone in a 2-bedroom house in Pasadena, California. And every morning I wake up at 5:30, make a pot of coffee, and sit by the window watching the neighborhood come to life. That routine has been mine for 11 years now, ever since my husband Raymond passed, and I learned that a quiet morning was not something to be afraid of. I want to tell you something before I start. I know what some of you will think when you hear my story. You will think, why did she keep giving? Why didn't she say no? I asked myself those questions too. For a long time, I had no answer. Then one afternoon, sitting alone in a hospital waiting room with a paper cup of cold coffee and a diagnosis I hadn't expected, I finally understood. I kept giving because I believed love was something you proved. I believed that if I just gave enough money, enough patience, enough silence, my daughter would one day look at me the way she used to when she was small. When I was her whole world and she was mine. I was wrong, and it cost me more than I can count. Let me start at the beginning. I worked as a certified public accountant for 38 years. I started at a small firm in Glendale, fresh out of California State, and I retired as a senior partner. I was not flashy about money. Raymond and I drove used cars, bought clothes on sale, took road trips instead of flights. We saved because we were taught that security was something you built quietly, with discipline, over decades. When Raymond died of a stroke at 59, I had the house paid off, a pension, and a savings account that I will not give you the exact number of, but it was enough. Enough for emergencies, enough for old age, enough for exactly what would eventually happen. My daughter's name is Diane. She is 38 now. Growing up, she was bright and headstrong and funny in a dry way that always caught me off guard. She got into UC San Diego on a partial scholarship. I paid the rest, $43,000 over 4 years. I paid it without blinking because Raymond and I had planned for it. That was what the money was for. I told her on the day she left for college, "This is your foundation. What you build on top of it is yours." She met her husband Daniel in her junior year. He was finishing a business degree, tall, well-dressed, the kind of young man who shook your hand firmly and looked you in the eye and made you feel, for reasons you couldn't quite explain, that he was already calculating something. I didn't trust him immediately. I told myself that was just a mother being protective. I tried very hard to like him. For years I succeeded. They married when Diane was 26. I paid for the wedding, $62,000, including the venue, the catering, the dress, the photographer. Daniel's parents contributed $7,000. His mother explained that they were a little stretched that year. I nodded and said it was no trouble. It was the first time I paid for something that I felt somewhere low and quiet in my chest. I should not have. I didn't listen to that feeling. I told myself, she's your only child. Raymond is gone. This is the one big day of her life. I wrote the check. They settled in Scottsdale, Arizona, where Daniel had been offered a position at a logistics company. Diane got a job as a marketing coordinator. They rented a nice apartment. I visited twice a year, brought groceries, cooked for them, made myself useful without making myself a burden. That was the balance I was always trying to find, present enough to matter, invisible enough not to irritate. About a year into their marriage, Diane called on a Sunday evening. She had that careful voice she used when she was about to ask for something she wasn't sure I'd agree to. She said, "Mom, Daniel found a house. It's perfect, but we're about $40,000 short on the down payment." I said, "How much is the house?" She told me. It was more than I expected. I asked, "What does your savings look like?" She was quiet for a moment, then said they had put a lot into furnishing the apartment and paying down Daniel's student loans. I did not ask follow-up questions. I had $40,000 in a short-term account doing almost nothing, and my daughter was asking for her first home. I told her I would wire it by Wednesday. She said, "I'll pay you back, Mom, I promise." I said, "I know." That was the second time I felt that low, quiet feeling. I ignored it again. They moved into the house in March. Diane sent me photos. It was a beautiful house, 4 bedrooms, a pool, a backyard big enough for the grandchildren they kept saying they would eventually have. I told myself the $40,000 was an investment in their future. I believed that for a while. 2 years later, Daniel left the logistics company to start his own freight consulting business. He had a plan, a client list, a pitch deck he showed me on a laptop during a Thanksgiving visit. I listened carefully. I was an accountant for nearly 4 decades. I could see 3 problems in the first 10 minutes. I mentioned one of them gently. Daniel smiled and said, "Margaret, I appreciate the input," in a tone that meant the opposite. Diane caught my eye across the table and gave me a small apologetic look that I had learned to recognize. It meant, "Please don't." So I didn't. 6 months later, Diane called again. The business was slower than expected. They needed help covering operating costs just for a few months, just until the client base stabilized. "Could I help with 25,000? I said. "Is the business going to make it?" She said. "Daniel believes in it completely." I noticed she didn't answer my question. I sent the 25,000. I told myself, "You believe in your daughter, and she believes in her husband." And sometimes that's enough. It wasn't a loan I expected back quickly. I just wanted them to be okay. They were not okay, not in the way I mean. The business did eventually turn a modest profit after about 2 years. But by then, I had sent 3 more transfers, 18,000, then 12,000, then 9,000 each time because something unexpected had come up. A tax bill, a roof repair, medical expenses when Daniel threw out his back and was unable to work for 6 weeks. I kept a spreadsheet. I am an accountant. Of course I kept a spreadsheet. By the time their daughter, my granddaughter, was born, I had given them $167,000 across 9 separate transfers. Some was labeled as loan. Most of it had never been mentioned again after the initial thank you. When Lily was born, everything changed for me. I flew to Scottsdale 3 days after the birth and held her for the first time and felt something shift in my chest that I have no clinical word for. She was 8 pounds, 2 ounces. She had Raymond's forehead. She looked at me with those dark, uncertain newborn eyes. And I thought, I would do anything for you. Anything at all. I think Daniel saw that. I think he filed it away. Over the next 2 years, Lily became the center of every conversation I had with Diane. I flew out every 2 months. I bought a plane seat. The way other grandmothers buy groceries regularly, without drama. I brought things for Lily, yes. But I also just wanted to be there. I wanted to be the grandmother who showed up. My own grandmother had been that person for me, and I had never forgotten it. What I did not notice, or what I noticed and chose not to name, was that each visit Daniel was a little more absent, working late, or out with clients, or slammed this week. "Margaret, hope you understand." I always said, "Of course. No trouble." And Diane seemed I searched for the word for a long time before I settled on it, managed. She seemed managed. The way you manage someone you are slightly afraid of. I want to be careful here, because I am telling you what I observed, not what I can prove. But I watched my daughter change between 32 and 36. She laughed less. She deferred more. When I said something that contradicted anything Daniel had said, she would get a particular stillness in her face that told me the subject was closed. Once, when I suggested we take Lily to the zoo without Daniel, just the 3 of us, a grandmother-mother-daughter afternoon, Diane said, "I'd have to check with Daniel first." Lily was 18 months old. It was a zoo trip. I didn't say anything. I drove back to the airport and sat at my gate for 2 hours thinking about the woman my daughter used to be. The request that broke something permanent in me came on a Tuesday morning, 14 months ago. Diane called while I was at my kitchen table doing a crossword. She didn't do her careful voice this time. She sounded rushed and a little flat, the way people sound when they are delivering a message they were told to deliver. She said Daniel had identified an investment opportunity, a commercial property partnership with 2 other local businessmen. The minimum buy-in was $80,000. They didn't have it. She asked if I could contribute the funds as a loan, to be repaid with interest once the property generated returns. I put down my pen. I said, "Diane, I need you to hear me ask this question seriously. When are you going to repay the money you already owe me?" There was a long pause. She said, "What money?" I said, $167,000. "I have a spreadsheet." Another pause. Then she said, "Mom, most of that was gifts. You never said it was a loan." I felt something cold move through me. I had said loan. I had used that word specifically on at least 4 of the 9 transfers. I had said it because I wanted to believe we had an understanding, because I did not want to feel like I was simply hemorrhaging my retirement, because I needed to believe my daughter was someone who would keep her word. I said loan. She said, I don't remember it that way. I said, I'm not sending $80,000. The call ended shortly after. Diane said she had to get Lily down for a nap. She said we would talk later. We did not talk later. For 6 weeks, the calls and texts became shorter and less frequent. I told myself it would pass. I sent Lily a birthday card with a check inside, not for Diane, not for Daniel, just for my granddaughter's 2nd birthday. Diane texted a thank you, 2 words. Then I received the invitation. Lily's 2nd birthday party, Saturday, April 12th, 2 o'clock. A children's party venue in Scottsdale called the Sunshine Garden. Diane had taken up a full page of the invitation describing the butterfly theme, the cake, the goodie bags. At the bottom, in small font, it said, limited capacity, immediate family only. Please RSVP by March 30th. I called Diane the same afternoon. I said, I got the invitation for Lily's party. She said, oh, right. I said, it says immediate family only. Am I invited? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mom, I was going to call you about this. Daniel feels that things between us are kind of tense right now, and he thinks it would be better if the party was just his parents, and us, and Lily. I said, his parents are coming. She said, they're local. I said, Diane, I am Lily's grandmother. She said, I know. I'm sorry. Can we just get through this week and then talk? I said, sure. And I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor the way it does in Pasadena, slow and golden, and I thought about the wedding I had paid for, the house, the 9 transfers, the $167,000. I thought about the zoo trip Diane needed Daniel's permission to take. I thought about the way she'd said, I don't remember it that way, with no hesitation at all, with a fluency that told me she had practiced it. I thought about my granddaughter, who was turning 2, who had Raymond's forehead, who I was not permitted to celebrate. Then I opened my laptop. I have a very good estate attorney. Her name is Patricia, and I have known her for 20 years. I emailed her that evening with 3 words in the subject line. Need to talk soon. I also called my doctor the next morning to reschedule an appointment I had been putting off. I had noticed some changes, fatigue mostly, a tenderness that I kept explaining away. I had been explaining it away for 4 months. The appointment was 2 weeks later. The results took another 10 days. The diagnosis was early-stage breast cancer. Left breast. Caught early. Treatable. The oncologist used words like favorable prognosis and high likelihood of full recovery. He was kind and methodical, and drew a small diagram on a notepad to show me what we were dealing with. I nodded and took notes because I am a person who takes notes. And then I drove home, made coffee, and sat at my window. I thought about the money. Not bitterly, just practically. The way I have always thought about numbers. The treatment would involve a lumpectomy, radiation, possibly a short course of hormone therapy. My insurance would cover most of it. The recovery would take time. I would not be able to work much for at least a few months. But I was retired. So, that didn't matter. What mattered was the cushion, the savings account I had built over 38 years of careful, quiet discipline. I opened the spreadsheet. I looked at the number that remained after $167,000 had left. It was enough. But it was not what it should have been. And I was 64 years old, about to undergo surgery, and I was going to do it without my daughter calling to check in, without anyone flying out to drive me to my appointments, without anyone sitting in the waiting room with a paper cup of bad coffee and a magazine they weren't really reading. I was going to do it alone. I went to see Patricia 3 days later. We sat in her office for 2 hours. I told her everything, calmly and in order, because I am an accountant. And I understand that clarity matters more than emotion when you are making permanent decisions. She listened without interrupting except to ask precise, necessary questions. When I was done, She folded her hands on the desk and looked at me. She said, "Do you want to wait and see if things change?" I said no. We spent the second hour going through the documents. I had a will that left the majority of my estate to Diane. I had a beneficiary designation on my pension account listing Diane. I had a trust structured to pass the house to her eventually. Patricia had drafted all of it, and she undid all of it with the same calm efficiency she had used to create it. I redirected the bulk of my estate to 3 places: a scholarship fund at California State in Raymond's name, a local hospice that had cared for Raymond in his final weeks, and my nephew James, Raymond's sister's son, who had called me every single week for 11 years without being asked to. I kept a small portion for Lily. In a separate trust, controlled by Patricia's firm, accessible to Lily at 21 with no parental access before then. That part I was certain about. I had my surgery in May. James flew in from Portland and stayed for a week. He slept on my guest room couch and drove me to my appointments and made a truly terrible chicken soup that I ate gratefully every single day. On the 3rd morning, while I was sitting in the oncology waiting room, my phone buzzed. It was Diane. She said, "Mom, Daniel told me you met with your attorney." I said, "I did." She said, "He's upset." I said, "I imagine he is." She said, "Can we talk about this?" I said, "I'm in a waiting room right now, Diane. I'm about to go in for a radiation follow-up." There was a pause. Then she said, "What? Why? What's wrong?" I realized, in that moment, that she didn't know. I had not told her. I had not told her because during the weeks between the diagnosis and the surgery, she had not called once. Not once. And I had decided, quietly and without anger, that I was not going to reach out first. I was going to wait and see how long it took. It had taken 6 weeks. I told her about the diagnosis. I told her it had been caught early and I was going to be fine. I told her James had been here. I told her everything. Plainly, and without drama. The silence on the other end was a very specific kind of silence. I have been a mother for 38 years. I know the difference between stunned silence and guilty silence. She said, "Mom, I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I needed to see what would happen if I waited." Another silence. Then, "That's not fair." I said, "No. A lot of things haven't been fair, Diane." She came to Pasadena 10 days later, without Daniel. She sat at my kitchen table and she cried in a way I had not seen since she was a teenager. And I sat across from her and I handed her tissues and I let her cry without telling her it was okay. Because it wasn't okay, and I had decided I was done saying it was. We talked for 4 hours. Some of it was hard. Some of it was the kind of conversation a mother and daughter should have had years earlier. Before resentment calcified into something structural, she told me things about her marriage that I will not repeat here because they are hers to tell, not mine. I will say only that they confirmed things I had observed and chosen not to name. I told her about the will. I did not apologize for it. I told her it reflected reality as I had experienced it, and that reality could change, but I was not going to pretend it already had. She asked about Lily. I told her about the trust. That Lily would be taken care of. That my granddaughter was never the one I was protecting myself from. Diane nodded. She wiped her face. She looked, for the first time in years, like the daughter I remembered tired and a little lost, but actually present. She said, "I'm sorry, Mom." I said, "I know." I said, "I love you." That has never changed. But love is not the same as unlimited access to my life and my savings. And I think somewhere along the way we forgot that. She stayed for dinner. We ate leftovers from the casserole James had made before he flew home, which was considerably better than his soup. We watched an old movie we both liked. When she hugged me at the door before leaving, she held on for a long time. I don't know what happens next with Daniel. I don't know if Diane will stay in that marriage or find the courage to leave it. I don't know if she will rebuild her finances or whether Daniel will someday make another phone call through her, asking me for something, expecting the answer to be yes. What I know is this. I had surgery on a Tuesday morning in May, and I recovered in my own home with James beside me, and I did not need anyone's permission to get better. I watered my plants. I finished my crossword books. I sat by the window and watched the light move across the floor. And I was not afraid. I am 64 years old. I worked for 38 years. I gave more than I should have. For longer than I should have. Because I mistook generosity for love. And silence for peace. I will not make that mistake again. My name is Margaret Chen. I am a mother, a grandmother, a widow, and a survivor of more than one thing. And I am still here, at my kitchen table, in the quiet morning, with my coffee and my window. And that, I have decided, is enough.